the inspiring story of Martin Luther King Jr. Sri Sit English Listening Practice. Learn English through real heroes. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, during a time when racial segregation shaped every aspect of daily life in the American South. At birth, he was named Michael King Jr., but his father, inspired by the Protestant reformer Martin Luther, later changed both of their names. That symbolic change reflected a family deeply connected to faith, moral courage, and the pursuit of justice. Martin grew up on Auburn Avenue, known as Sweet Auburn, a center of black business and culture in Atlanta. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a respected Baptist minister who often preached against racial inequality from the pulpit of Ebenezer Baptist Church. His mother, Alberta Williams King, was an educated schoolteacher who filled their home with music, reading, and spiritual reflection. The King household valued education, hard work, and a belief that faith could transform society. Although surrounded by love, young Martin could not escape the harsh reality of racism. At age 6, one of his white playmates suddenly told him they could no longer be friends because their parents forbade it. The reason was skin color. Martin was heartbroken. His parents explained the cruel system known as Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation in schools, buses, restaurants, and public facilities. That experience planted an early seed of awareness. The world was unjust, but injustice did not have to be permanent. From an early age, Martin displayed unusual intelligence and curiosity. He skipped the 9th and 12th grades, entering Morehouse College, the same school his father and grandfather had attended, at just 15. At Morehouse, the young student encountered new ideas about morality, philosophy, and social change. He read Plato, Aristotle, and the sermons of theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, and he began to sense that intellect and compassion could work together to heal society's wounds. College President Benjamin E. Mays, himself a powerful voice for civil rights, became a lifelong mentor and urged students to see life as service. When Martin first entered college, ministry was not his plan. He imagined becoming a doctor or lawyer. Yet as he listened to his father's sermons and to Dr. Mays's speeches about spiritual leadership, he began to feel a quiet but persistent calling. He realized that the church could be not only a place of worship, but also a platform for justice. By the time he graduated in 1948 with a degree in sociology, he had decided to become a minister who would speak to the moral conscience of the nation. After Morehouse, King studied at Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. There, for the first time, he lived in an integrated community where white and black students studied together. So he sometimes faced prejudice, such as being refused service at restaurants. At Crozer, he learned about the life and philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, whose movement for Indian independence was based on nonviolent resistance. King was captivated by Gandhi's belief that peaceful protest could awaken the oppressor's conscience. He began to imagine applying similar methods to confront racial injustice in America. King's classmates respected his calm confidence and moral seriousness. He was elected student body president and graduated at the top of his class in 1951. That same year, he entered Boston University to pursue a doctorate in systematic theology. Boston exposed him to a broader world, diverse cultures, ideas, and social freedoms uncommon in the segregated South. There he met Coretta Scott, a gifted singer and intellectual from Alabama who shared his passion for equality and education. Their partnership became both romantic and revolutionary. They married in 1953 and would eventually have 4 children: Yolanda, Martin III, Dexter, and Bernice. While completing his doctoral studies, King worked on developing a philosophy that combined Christian ethics with social responsibility. He wrote that love was not a sentimental emotion, but a moral power that could transform enemies into friends. This idea would later define his entire movement. He earned his PhD in 1955, becoming Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at only 26 years old. Despite his growing academic success, King never lost touch with the realities of racial discrimination. During visits home to Atlanta, he still had to sit in the colored section of trains and buses. He witnessed how poverty and violence shaped black life in the South. These contradictions between his education and his lived experience strengthened his determination to change the system peacefully but firmly. In 1954, King accepted a position as pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. The congregation was small but energetic, and the city was simmering with frustration over segregation on public buses. King had no idea that within a year, Montgomery would become the flashpoint for a movement that would transform American society, and that he would be at its center. At this point, the young minister's life story had already woven together all the threads that would later define him: deep faith, rigorous education, courage in the face of injustice, and an unshakable belief in the moral power of nonviolence. The boy who once lost a friend because of race was about to become the man who taught a nation that love is stronger than hate. In the spring of 1954, a 25-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. accepted his first full-time post as pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. The small red brick church stood just a few blocks from the state capitol, a symbol of political power that enforced racial segregation throughout the South. King arrived with energy, intellect, and a calm but fiery sense of purpose. He believed that his ministry should not only save souls but also serve society. Montgomery in the 1950s was a city divided by Jim Crow laws. Black citizens made up more than half of the population, yet they could not vote freely, attend white schools, or sit in the front of public buses. Buses, in particular, had become an everyday symbol of humiliation. The first 10 seats were reserved for white passengers. Black passengers were forced to sit in the back or stand even when seats remained empty. For years, the black community had quietly protested this injustice, but little changed. Then, on December 1st, 1955, something remarkable happened that would shake the city and the entire nation. That afternoon, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks boarded a Montgomery bus after finishing her work at a local department store. She sat in the first row of the section designated for black passengers. As the bus filled, white passengers boarded, and the driver ordered Parks and 3 others to stand so that white passengers could sit. The others obeyed. Parks refused. She simply said, "No." Her quiet defiance led to her arrest for violating segregation laws. Word of her courage spread quickly through the black community. Local leaders from the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, gathered to discuss a response. Among them was E.D. Nixon, a longtime activist, and several ministers, including the young Martin Luther King Jr. Because of his reputation for integrity and eloquence, King was chosen to lead the movement. That evening, he reluctantly agreed. "If we are wrong," he told them, "then justice is a lie." The next morning, the city awoke to an extraordinary sight: empty buses. On December 5, 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott began. Tens of thousands of black residents refused to ride the buses, walking miles to work, school, and church. Some shared car rides, others organized community carpools. King's Church became the meeting ground where volunteers coordinated routes and drivers. Despite police harassment, people persevered. That night, more than 5,000 supporters packed Holt Street Baptist Church to hear their new leader speak. Standing before the crowd, King's voice was steady but passionate. There comes a time when people get tired of being trampled by the iron feet of oppression. We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court is wrong. If we are wrong, the Bible is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. The crowd erupted in applause. Many described the speech as electric, a moment when fear turned into faith. King urged everyone to maintain discipline and nonviolence. We must meet hate with love. That single idea, love as a weapon stronger than hate, became the moral foundation of the entire civil rights movement. The boycott quickly drew national attention. Newspapers across America published photographs of Montgomery's empty buses and long lines of people walking in the rain. Some white citizens were outraged. King's home was bombed while his wife and baby daughter were inside. Miraculously, they were unharmed. That night, as neighbors gathered outside ready to retaliate, King stood on his porch and pleaded with them, "Don't strike back, love your enemies, do not become what we despise." His words calmed the crowd. Reporters later wrote that this moment transformed King from a local pastor into a national moral voice. The city fought back with arrests and intimidation. Police ticketed carpool drivers for trivial violations. King himself was arrested in January 1956 for driving 30 miles per hour in a 25-mile zone, a clear act of harassment. During his brief time in jail, he prayed and reflected on the meaning of sacrifice. He realized that freedom always carries a price, and he was willing to pay it. Despite threats and fatigue, the movement endured for 381 days. Churches became transportation centers, volunteers repaired tires and engines, women cooked meals for walkers. The boycott's strength came from ordinary people who refused to give up. A domestic worker named Georgia Gilmore sold cakes to raise money for gas. An elderly woman walked 12 miles every day, saying, "My feet are tired, but my soul is rested." Finally, on November 13, 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. On December 21st, after a full year of resistance, Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks rode together on an integrated bus. The long walk to freedom had taken its first successful step. The Montgomery bus boycott became a blueprint for peaceful protest. It proved that disciplined nonviolent resistance could challenge deeply rooted injustice without bloodshed. It also revealed King's extraordinary leadership, his ability to speak with reason and compassion, to unite diverse groups, and to turn personal suffering into collective strength. But success brought new responsibilities. Reporters sought interviews, churches invited him to speak, enemies issued death threats. King's phone rang day and night, some calls filled with praise, others with hate. One night, exhausted and afraid, he bowed his head over a cup of coffee and whispered a prayer. "Lord, I am down here trying to do what is right, but I am weak. I am losing courage." He later wrote that he felt God's presence whisper back, "Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for truth. I will be with you." That moment renewed his strength. King realized his mission was larger than Montgomery. He envisioned a nationwide movement where nonviolence would be both a strategy and a moral way of life. By 1957, the success of the boycott led to the creation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, with King as its first president. Its purpose? To coordinate civil rights actions across the South. From that platform, King began traveling from city to city, preaching the gospel of love and justice. The Montgomery victory did not end segregation, but it cracked its foundations. More importantly, It awakened millions of Americans, black and white alike, to the possibility of peaceful change. The young preacher from Georgia had become the moral compass of a generation. He had discovered the power of organized faith, disciplined courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice through peace. When asked years later what gave him the courage to lead, King replied simply, "I just tried to do God's will." By the early 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. had become the most recognized voice of the civil rights movement in America. The Montgomery bus boycott had made him a national figure, but King knew the struggle for justice was far from over. Across the southern United States, racial segregation and discrimination were still enforced by local laws and violent traditions. Black Americans continued to be denied the right to vote, attend equal schools, or enjoy public facilities on the same terms as white citizens. After Montgomery, King and other civil rights leaders established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Its mission was to organize nonviolent protests across the South. Rather than acting alone, King believed the movement needed to be strategic, coordinated, and deeply rooted in Christian principles. His message was simple but revolutionary. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The road to Birmingham. In 1963, the SCLC turned its attention to Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most racially divided cities in the United States. Birmingham's police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, was notorious for his brutal treatment of black citizens. Segregation was strictly enforced in restaurants, schools, public parks, and even drinking fountains. For years, local activists had tried and failed to make progress. King believed Birmingham could be the turning point. The SCLC partnered with local leaders, including Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, to launch what became known as the Birmingham Campaign. The plan was to apply direct action, peaceful marches, sit-ins, and economic boycotts to pressure city officials into negotiating civil rights reforms. On April 3, 1963, the campaign began. Protesters marched peacefully through downtown Birmingham, demanding an end to segregation. They sat in whites-only areas at lunch counters and picketed outside businesses that refused to hire black workers. Police arrested hundreds. Among them were ministers, students, and even elderly women. King himself joined a march on April 12th and was arrested for violating a court injunction that banned all protests. He was taken to Birmingham City Jail, where he spent 8 days in solitary confinement. Letter from Birmingham Jail. While in jail, King received a newspaper containing a letter written by 8 white clergymen who criticized the protests as unwise and untimely. They urged black citizens to be patient and allow change to happen through the courts, not the streets. King was deeply disappointed by their words. From his tiny cell, using scraps of paper and the margins of the newspaper, he began to write a response. That response became one of the most important documents of the civil rights era, the letter from Birmingham Jail. In the letter, King defended the necessity of non-violent direct action. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. He explained that waiting patiently had only prolonged injustice, and that justice too long delayed is justice denied. He urged white moderates not to remain silent, and reminded religious leaders of their moral duty to speak out. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I must confess that I am gravely disappointed with the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice. His words were not angry. They were measured, logical, and morally powerful. The letter circulated across the country, published in newspapers and shared in churches. It became a call to conscience, especially for white Americans who had previously ignored or misunderstood the movement. The Children's Crusade. After King was released from jail, the Birmingham campaign escalated. On May 2, 1963, in a bold and controversial decision, SCLC leaders organized a youth protest known as the Children's Crusade. Hundreds of school children, some as young as 6 years old, marched through the streets, singing freedom songs and demanding change. The police responded with violence. Under Bull Connor's orders, firemen blasted children with high-pressure water hoses. Police dogs were released. Children were dragged into police vans and sent to jail by the hundreds. The horrifying images were captured by photographers and broadcast across the nation. Americans were shocked. Many had not realized how brutal the resistance to civil rights had become. King and his allies had always known that media exposure would play a crucial role in changing public opinion. These images met scene of innocent children being attacked while peacefully marching forced the country to confront its own conscience. Even President John F. Kennedy could not ignore what was happening. Within weeks, city officials agreed to begin desegregation in Birmingham. Black citizens would be allowed access to public facilities, and discriminatory hiring practices would begin to change. The Birmingham campaign had won a symbolic and strategic victory, and the movement grew stronger. From Birmingham to the nation, King now realized that the movement needed to take its message beyond the South. The next logical step was a national demonstration, one that would gather people from all races, regions, and religions to speak with one voice for equality. That plan became the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, scheduled for August 28, 1963. It would become one of the largest political rallies in American history. But before the march, King faced personal trials. His leadership was often criticized. Some activists believed his approach was too cautious, while others felt it was too aggressive. He received death threats daily. His family needed constant protection. Still, he pressed forward. By the summer of 1963, the civil rights movement had reached a decisive moment. In cities across the American South, peaceful protests had drawn attention to racial injustice, police brutality, and economic inequality. Martin Luther King Jr. and his fellow leaders from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, had helped organize nonviolent campaigns in Montgomery, Birmingham, and other cities. Now it was time to take the movement to the national stage, to the very center of political power. Washington, D.C., the goal was bold: to organize a massive gathering that would demonstrate national support for civil rights legislation and economic justice. Civil rights leaders believed that showing unity, strength, and dignity in the nation's capital could push Congress and the president to act. Thus, the idea for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was born. The March on Washington was a collaborative effort among several civil rights organizations, including SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by King NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, led by Roy Wilkins, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led by John Lewis Core, Congress of Racial Equality, led by James Farmer National Urban League, led by Whitney Young, These groups had different strategies and ideologies, but they shared a common goal: to demand civil and economic rights for African Americans. The march was scheduled for August 28, 1963. Planning the march, organizing a demonstration of this size, was a huge challenge. Leaders worried about violence, transportation issues, and whether people would actually show up. They had less than 2 months to prepare. King and his team worked with Bayard Rustin, an experienced activist and organizer. Rustin coordinated the logistics, arranging buses, permits, food, sound systems, and volunteers. More than 250,000 people were expected to attend, including black and white Americans, union workers, students, clergy, and celebrities. Their message was clear and simple. We demand the passage of meaningful civil rights legislation. We demand an end to police brutality. We demand equal access to public education. We demand decent housing. We demand jobs and freedom. Now, as the date approached, people from across the country prepared to travel to Washington. Many had never left their home states before. Some churches raised funds to rent buses. Families packed meals for the long journey. People were not just attending a protest, they were becoming part of history. The day of the march. On the morning of August 28, 1963, tens of thousands of people flooded the streets of Washington, D.C. The weather was warm and sunny. Demonstrators carried signs with messages like, "Jobs not jail," "We shall overcome," and "End segregation now." There was a sense of excitement, hope, and unity in the air. People gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial, the iconic monument to the president who had signed the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years earlier. The choice of this location was symbolic. It linked the struggle for civil rights in 1963 to the promise of freedom made in 1863. The crowd included students, laborers, ministers, nuns, veterans, and artists. Celebrities like Harry Belafonte, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Mahalia Jackson performed or attended. Reporters and photographers from around the world covered the event live. The program included musical performances, prayers, and speeches from civil rights leaders. One of the most powerful came from John Lewis, a 23-year-old leader of SNCC, who passionately criticized the federal government's inaction. But the most anticipated moment came at the end of the program, the speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. "I have a dream." As King stepped to the podium, the crowd fell silent. Standing in front of the towering statue of Lincoln, King began with a prepared speech. But as he spoke, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, standing nearby, called out to him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." Inspired, King shifted away from his script and began to speak from the heart. The next words he delivered became some of the most iconic in human history. "I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The crowd responded with cheers, tears, and applause. His voice rose with conviction as he painted a picture of a future without racism, a future where children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He imagined former slaves and slave owners sitting together at the table of brotherhood. He called for mountains of despair to become stones of hope, and he concluded with words that echoed like a national prayer. When we let freedom ring, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The speech lasted about 17 minutes. Its impact has lasted decades. The impact of the march. The March on Washington was a resounding success. More than 250,000 people attended peacefully, one of the largest political rallies in U.S. history. It showed the power of unity, the strength of nonviolence, and the importance of moral leadership. King's speech became a symbol of hope, progress, and patriotism. Television networks replayed it. Newspapers published it. School children memorized it. It moved not only black Americans, but millions of others across the country who had remained silent. Now they were inspired to speak. 1 year later, in 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, giving black citizens the full right to vote. The March on Washington was not the end of the struggle. There were still years of protests, violence, and sacrifice ahead, but it was a turning point. A moment when the nation saw what dignity, courage, and unity looked like. Dr. King had shown the world that words could be weapons of peace. His dream became a shared vision for generations to come. Following the triumph of the March on Washington in August 1963 and Martin Luther King Jr.'s iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, the civil rights movement stood at its most visible and hopeful moment. The nation had witnessed the power of nonviolent protest and had seen a peaceful interracial crowd demand justice in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. But the road ahead would be more difficult. While millions were inspired, others were enraged. Local officials, white supremacists, and even some politicians began pushing back. For King and the movement, the years that followed were filled with struggles, sacrifices, and painful setbacks. But they also revealed the depth of King's strength and moral leadership. A season of violence. Just 18 days after the March on Washington, tragedy struck. On September 15, 1963, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The church was a central meeting place for civil rights activists. The bomb, planted by white supremacists, killed 4 young black girls: Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley. The attack shocked the nation. Images of the girls' funeral were broadcast across the country. Martin Luther King Jr., who had led the Birmingham campaign just months earlier, delivered the eulogy. His voice trembled with emotion as he said, "These children, unoffending, innocent, and beautiful, were the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever committed against humanity." He called for forgiveness, not revenge. But his grief ran deep. The bombing reminded King and the world that hatred was still powerful and deadly. Political pushback and surveillance. While King was celebrated by many, not everyone saw him as a hero. Inside the U.S. government, some officials feared the growing influence of the civil rights movement. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, was particularly hostile toward King. Hoover believed King might be a communist sympathizer and began a secret campaign to undermine him. The FBI wiretapped King's phones, followed his travels, and tried to gather damaging information. They even sent him an anonymous letter attempting to blackmail him into silence. King knew he was being watched, but he refused to be intimidated. "If I am stopped, this movement will not stop," he once said, "because God is with this movement." This period tested not just his public strength, but also his private resilience. He was often exhausted, isolated, and under immense pressure. Still, he moved forward. Selma and the fight for voting rights. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, banning segregation in public spaces, many people believed the struggle was over. But King knew that voting rights remained the missing piece of the puzzle. In the South, black citizens still faced impossible literacy tests, poll taxes, and threats if they tried to vote. To address this, King and the SCLC began organizing a campaign in Selma, Alabama, in early 1965. Selma was chosen because its white officials had a long record of blocking black voter registration. King worked alongside John Lewis, James Bevel, and local activists to organize peaceful marches demanding the right to vote. The most famous march took place on March 7, 1965, a day now known as Bloody Sunday. Around 600 peaceful protesters attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. As they reached the top, they were met by a wall of state troopers and local police, armed with clubs and tear gas. The marchers were beaten, trampled, and chased back. Among them was John Lewis, who suffered a fractured skull. The horrifying footage of the violence was broadcast nationwide, shocking Americans and prompting a wave of outrage. King responded by calling for another march, this time with national support. On March 23rd, over 25,000 people, black and white, young and old, religious and secular, joined him in a 5-day march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The march was a turning point. 5 months later, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, outlawing discriminatory voting practices. It was one of the greatest victories of the movement. But it had come at a terrible cost. Inner struggles and growing criticism. While King was praised for his moral clarity, not everyone in the movement agreed with his methods. By the late 1960s, a new generation of activists, influenced by Malcolm X and the rise of Black Power, began to question whether nonviolence was still effective. They were frustrated by the slow pace of change and the continued violence against black communities. King respected these new voices but remained committed to nonviolence, believing that hate could never drive out hate. At the same time, he began to expand his message to include poverty, labor rights, and anti-war activism. He criticized the Vietnam War, saying, "The bombs in Vietnam explode at home. They destroy the hopes and possibilities for a decent America." This stand lost him support among some former allies, including politicians and even the mainstream media. Donations to the SCLC declined. Some churches distanced themselves, but King refused to compromise his principles. "A time comes when silence is betrayal," he said. "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." The Poor People's Campaign. By 1967, King was preparing what he believed could be the movement's most ambitious effort, the Poor People's Campaign. The campaign aimed to bring Black, white, Latino, and Native American people together to demand economic justice, fair housing, jobs, health care, and education for the poor across America. King planned a massive encampment in Washington, D.C., where the poor would gather peacefully to demand federal action. He called it a revolution of values. The campaign's message was clear. Civil rights without economic justice was not enough. But this new vision brought new enemies. Critics accused King of turning the movement into a socialist project. His supporters were divided, yet King pressed forward. In early 1968, he traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, to support a strike by black sanitation workers demanding fair wages and dignity. He saw their cause as a symbol of the larger economic struggle, a final sacrifice. On April 3, 1968, King delivered what would become his final speech at the Mason Temple in Memphis. It was a stormy night, and King arrived late, tired and unwell, yet his voice carried power and prophecy. "I've been to the mountain top, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." The next evening, on April 4, 1968, as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, King was assassinated by a sniper. He was just 39 years old. News of his death triggered riots in over 100 cities. Millions wept. The nation mourned the loss of a man who had become not only a leader, but a moral symbol of hope. Yet even in death, his message lived on. His legacy inspired generations to fight for justice, peace, and equality. The March on Washington in 1963 marked a turning point in American history. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, "I Have a Dream," had echoed across the National Mall and into the hearts of millions. It was a moment of triumph, unity, and profound moral clarity. But behind the scenes, King knew that such moments were not the end of a journey, they were only beginnings, and the path ahead would be filled with pain, resistance, and sacrifice. Within just weeks of the march's success, the civil rights movement was confronted with raw brutality that shattered the nation's fragile hope. On September 15, 1963, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The church was a known meeting place for civil rights activists and a spiritual refuge for the local black community. The blast killed 4 young girls, Addie Mae Collins, 14, Denise McNair, 11, Carol Robertson, 14, and Cynthia Wesley, 14, as they were preparing for Sunday service. The attack was carried out by white supremacists, members of the Ku Klux Klan, furious at the momentum of the civil rights movement. The bombing was not just an act of hate, it was a message meant to terrify, silence, and halt the movement's progress. But it did not stop Martin Luther King Jr., though it wounded him deeply. At the memorial service, King delivered a heart-wrenching eulogy for the girls. Standing before the shattered families and a grieving community, his words carried sorrow and spiritual strength. These children, unoffending, innocent, and beautiful, were the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. King's voice trembled with grief, yet he called for forgiveness, not vengeance. He urged the mourners to channel their pain into renewed commitment, not hatred. His message was as unwavering as ever. Nonviolence was the only path forward. Still, King knew that the world had changed that day. The civil rights movement had entered a new phase, one marked not just by marches and speeches, but by loss and bloodshed. Government eyes turn inward. While the public face of Martin Luther King Jr. was that of a preacher of peace, behind closed doors, powerful forces were working against him. One of the most significant was J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. Hoover viewed King as a threat, not just politically, but ideologically. The FBI falsely suspected King had ties to communism, and in 1963, They began a covert surveillance operation. His phones were wiretapped. His hotel rooms were bugged. FBI agents tracked his movements and collected private information in an attempt to discredit him both personally and publicly. In one chilling move, the FBI even sent King an anonymous letter accompanied by damaging recordings trying to pressure him into resignation, or worse. The letter suggested that King was a hypocrite and that he should take his own life before he was exposed. King shared the letter with close aides and chose to stand his ground. Despite the fear, humiliation, and emotional weight, he refused to abandon his mission. "If I am stopped, this movement will not stop," he declared. "If I fall, others will rise." This relentless pressure took a toll on his physical and mental health. He was often fatigued. He struggled with depression. He missed his children's milestones. But even in the face of state surveillance and targeted attacks, he continued to speak, travel, organize, and inspire. Selma and the right to vote. By 1965, King had turned his attention to one of the greatest remaining injustices in America: voter suppression. Although the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had outlawed segregation in public spaces, it had not ensured voting rights. In many southern states, black citizens still faced rigged literacy tests, discriminatory poll taxes, threats, and even violence when trying to register to vote. One of the worst examples was Selma, Alabama. In early 1965, King and the SCLC, along with local leaders like Amelia Boynton, James Bevel, and John Lewis, organized a campaign to highlight this injustice. The strategy: peaceful marches to draw national attention to the suppression of black voters. On March 7, 1965, approximately 600 peaceful demonstrators attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery. As they reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were confronted by heavily armed state troopers and local law enforcement. Without warning, the officers charged. They beat the marchers with clubs, released tear gas, and trampled them with horses. Among the injured was John Lewis, whose skull was fractured. The event was broadcast across the country. Americans watching television that Sunday saw a peaceful protest turned into a violent nightmare. The images of bloodied heads, broken bones, and tearful cries shocked the conscience of the nation. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. By late 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. was not just a leader of the American civil rights movement, he had become a symbol of nonviolent resistance and moral leadership across the world. The victories of the early 1960s, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, had been hard-won through marches, sit-ins, boycotts, and immense personal sacrifice. King's message had moved beyond black and white, beyond North and South. It had become a universal call to conscience. Then, in October 1964, came a moment that shocked even King himself. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The youngest peace laureate, at just 35 years old, Martin Luther King Jr. became the youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Committee in Oslo, Norway, recognized him for his non-violent struggle against racial inequality and his unwavering commitment to human dignity. When informed of the award, King said he accepted it with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind. He traveled to Norway in December 1964 with his wife, Coretta Scott King, and a small delegation. In his acceptance speech, he made it clear that the award was not a personal honor. It belonged to the movement. "I accept this award on behalf of a civil rights movement, which is moving with determination and a majestic scorn for risk and danger to establish a reign of freedom and a rule of justice. King's speech acknowledged the struggle still ahead. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. The speech was broadcast around the world. People saw a young black preacher from the American South standing before kings, diplomats, and world leaders, not as a victim of racism, but as a global voice of peace. A shift in focus. Although deeply honored by the Nobel Prize, King returned to the U.S. with the knowledge that his mission was far from complete. Even with the Civil Rights Act passed, daily life for millions of black Americans remained marked by poverty, police brutality, poor housing, and lack of access to education. More and more, King began to broaden the goals of the civil rights movement. His speeches and sermons now began to address not only racism, but economic inequality, class injustice, and international peace. This evolution in his message made some people uncomfortable, even some of his former allies. King began to face growing criticism from both directions. White conservatives who believed he was stirring up trouble, and younger black activists who felt his nonviolent approach was outdated. King welcomed the tension. In fact, he believed it was necessary. There is nothing wrong with tension. We must learn to live with creative tension, speaking out against war. In 1967, as the Vietnam War escalated, King did something many civil rights leaders had advised against. He publicly condemned the war. In a powerful speech titled Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, delivered at Riverside Church in New York City, King called the war a tragic betrayal of American values. He argued that the war disproportionately drafted and killed young black men. The money spent on bombs could have been used to fight poverty. A nation that promotes violence abroad cannot build justice at home. The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government, he declared. The backlash was swift and severe. Many newspapers condemned the speech. Donors withdrew funding from King's organization. Even some civil rights leaders distanced themselves, but King stood firm. He believed that silence in the face of injustice, any injustice, was a betrayal of his principles. A time comes when silence is betrayal, he said, and that time has come for us. The Poor People's Campaign. Inspired by his deepening concern for economic justice, King spent the final year of his life planning a massive national movement called the Poor People's Campaign. The campaign sought to unite Americans of all backgrounds, black, white, Latino, and Native, around a single demand: an end to poverty. The idea was bold. Thousands of poor people would come to Washington, D.C., set up an encampment, and remain there until the federal government responded with serious policy changes. Their demands included guaranteed employment or income, fair housing, better public education, healthcare access for all a living wage. King described the movement as a revolution of values. He argued that the U.S. needed to shift from being a society focused on things to one centered on people. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, he said. Not everyone in his circle supported the idea. Some feared it would be too confrontational. Others worried it would divide the movement. King insisted it was the natural next step. What good is it to sit at an integrated lunch counter if you can't afford a hamburger? Memphis and the final days before the Poor People's Campaign could launch, King was called to Memphis, Tennessee in March 1968. There, black sanitation workers were on strike, demanding better wages and working conditions. Two of their co-workers had been crushed to death by faulty garbage trucks, and city officials refused to recognize the workers' union. King saw their struggle as a perfect symbol of the broader campaign: dignity, labor rights, and economic fairness. On April 3, 1968, King gave a speech at the Mason Temple in Memphis. Though he was tired and sick with a fever, he spoke with renewed passion. He seemed to sense the end was near. "We got some difficult days ahead, he said, "but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountain top and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." The next evening, April 4th, 1968, King was shot and killed while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He was 39 years old. In the spring of 1968, the United States stood at a crossroads. The war in Vietnam raged on. Cities were gripped by poverty, inequality, and unrest. Racial tensions remained high. Many civil rights laws had been passed, but true equality still felt distant for millions of Americans. In this moment of uncertainty and frustration, Martin Luther King Jr. was more than a leader. He was a moral compass, guiding the nation toward justice, peace, and compassion. But King himself was weary. Years of relentless travel, threats, arrests, and internal criticism had taken a toll on him. He often felt isolated. His family worried for his safety. His health suffered. Yet he refused to step back. "I must be faithful to my calling," he said. "The struggle is not over. My place is with the people who suffer." A new battle: economic justice. In the final year of his life, Dr. King began what he believed would be the most important mission of his career: the Poor People's Campaign. He had come to believe that the fight for civil rights could not end with legal equality. It had to extend to economic dignity, the right to housing, healthcare, education, and a living wage. He called poverty a national disgrace. He said that America had enough wealth to eliminate hunger and homelessness, but lacked the moral will. The Poor People's Campaign was not just for Black Americans. It was designed to unite poor white workers, Latino farm workers, Native Americans, and others suffering under the weight of systemic poverty. King envisioned thousands of people gathering in Washington, D.C., in a peaceful encampment to demand real change. He knew it would be risky, and he knew it would be controversial. But he believed it was necessary. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar, he preached. It understands that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Memphis, the final mission. In March 1968, King traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, to support a strike by black sanitation workers. The workers were underpaid, forced to work in dangerous conditions, and denied the dignity of union recognition. Two workers had recently been crushed to death in a garbage truck, and the city's refusal to improve safety triggered mass outrage. The strikers carried signs that read, "I am a man," a bold demand for recognition of their humanity. King saw the strike as a reflection of the national crisis of poverty and injustice. Though his advisors urged him to focus on the upcoming Poor People's Campaign, King insisted on going to Memphis. He believed that solidarity with working people was central to his cause. His first march in Memphis ended in chaos. Violence broke out when some participants broke from nonviolence, and King was devastated. Determined to make things right, he returned on April 3rd to deliver a final message of hope and resilience. "I've been to the mountaintop." That night, Dr. King spoke at the Mason Temple Church of God in Christ. The weather was stormy, and many believed he wouldn't attend. But when he arrived, tired and hoarse, he delivered what many consider his most prophetic speech. He reminded the audience that the road to justice was long, filled with threats and suffering, but that victory was certain if they remained committed to love and non-violence. Then, near the end of the speech, his tone shifted. He spoke as if he foresaw his own death. "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The audience rose in thunderous applause. Some wept, others prayed. It would be the last speech he ever gave. April 4th, 1968. The assassination. The next evening, April 4th, 1968, Dr. King stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, speaking to colleagues below. He was relaxed, joking about dinner plans. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. A bullet struck King in the jaw and severed his spinal cord. He was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, but was pronounced dead an hour later. He was just 39 years old. The nation erupted in grief. In over 100 U.S. cities, riots broke out. Fires burned. People cried in the streets. Others gathered in silence. Churches rang their bells. Schools held memorial services. The country was in mourning, not just for the man, but for what his death represented, a legacy that lives on. Martin Luther King Jr. left behind no fortune, no elected office, no military title. Only words, sacrifice, and a powerful moral vision. Yet his legacy continues to shape laws, inspire leaders, and awaken the conscience of generations. Within days of his death, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act of 1968, prohibiting discrimination in housing, one of the many causes King had championed. His teachings of non-violence, love in the face of hatred, and justice through peaceful resistance have influenced movements around the world. From South Africa to India, from climate activism to refugee rights. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a law declaring Martin Luther King Jr. Day a national holiday, observed each year on the third Monday in January. Today, King's speeches are taught in schools. His name graces streets, schools, and monuments. His words are quoted by presidents and protesters alike. But more than all that, King's legacy lives in the ongoing struggle for justice, in every person who stands up against hate, in every community that chooses peace over violence, and in every voice that dares to say injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.